The air in Bunker S10 was solid, heavy as a tombstone, compressed from concrete dust, the smell of ozone, sweat, and that primal animal terror that has no name or scent but is felt on the skin like the touch of something cold and dead. 9 hours had passed since the world outside had ceased to exist in any form they knew, and a new, unknown one was born in a blinding flash. Inside the concrete tomb, buried under tons of sand and debris, were 4 men. 4 creators, now the first prisoners of their creation. Dr. Arthur Wallace, the senior physicist, sat on the floor, his back against the cold, vibrating wall. In his hand was a piece of graphite, and on the dusty concrete floor, in the trembling light of a single emergency lantern, he drew endless rows of formulas. This wasn't science in its high, pure sense. It was a shamanistic ritual, an attempt to exorcise the demon he himself had helped release from its bottle. Every number, every variable, was part of a prayer for salvation, addressed not to God, but to the inexorable laws of physics. His face, covered in a layer of gray dust, resembled the mask of an ancient tragedian. His eyes, inflamed and dry, never left the calculations. He was trying to compute the decay rate of the isotopes to understand when the invisible death outside the bunker's walls would loosen its grip, when their prison could once again become a shelter, and not a sarcophagus. Across from him huddled sat Frank Kowalski, a young technician. He wasn't looking at the formulas. He was staring at his hands, at his trembling fingers, and muttering something under his breath. For him, a man of wires and relays, this silence, broken only by the crackle of the Geiger counter and the moans of a wounded soldier, was a torture worse than any scream. He was born for action, to twist, to solder, to connect. And here, in this stillness, his energy turned to poison, eating away at his sanity from within. The crackle of the Geiger counter was the only rhythm of their new world. Relentless, indifferent, like the ticking of a clock counting down the last seconds of life. Each click, click, click was another nail being hammered into the lid of their shared coffin. Leo Silvers, the youngest of the physicists, was trying to care for the 4th man, Private Miller, a soldier assigned to guard them. The young man had been crushed by a concrete slab during the collapse, and now lay in a corner, moaning softly. His breathing was ragged and uneven. Leo moistened the soldier's lips with the last drops of water from his canteen. But he knew it was only a postponement. There was no room for mercy in their world. They were the first inhabitants of the atomic age, and their only law had become the law of survival. How did these men who only yesterday considered themselves demiurges, masters of the atom, end up trapped at the epicenter of the hell they themselves had created? How did the triumph of the human mind turn into the primal horror of being buried alive? To understand this, to hear the story they tried to erase from every report, we must go back 12 hours, to that last night of the old world, when they still believed they held God by the beard, never suspecting he was about to break free and incinerate them. 12 hours earlier, Bunker S10, or South 10 as it was called in the documents, was buzzing with a restrained, nervous excitement. It was the most forward observation post, just 10,000 yards, a little over 9 kilometers, about 5.7 miles, from the steel tower atop which rested the Gadget, a strange, almost absurd name for a device that was meant to change the course of world history. Here, in the cramped concrete room smelling of fresh paint, cooling coffee, and tobacco, were gathered those who were too young or too insignificant for the main command post, but whose brains were too valuable to be kept at a safe distance. Arthur Wallace, a 32-year-old theoretical physicist, was their unofficial leader. Slender, with thick-lensed glasses, he possessed a rare ability to see the world not as a chaos of phenomena, but as an elegant system of equations. He checked and rechecked the calculations for the explosion's yield, the strength of their shelter, the propagation of the shockwave. The numbers on the paper added up perfectly. They were completely safe. But somewhere in the depths of his analytical mind, a worm of doubt stirred. Their calculations were based on theory, on assumptions. No one had ever done anything like this before. They were standing on the threshold of completely uncharted territory, and their only map consisted of formulas written in chalk on a blackboard. Frank Kowalski, the communications technician, on the other hand, was full of boyish enthusiasm. He tinkered with the radio equipment, checking the connection with the main bunker and other posts, and told tall tales. "Guys," he said, flashing a pearly white smile, "tomorrow morning we're going to see a new son being born. A second son made in America. I'll bet $5 the light will be visible all the way to Los Angeles." His optimism was contagious, but Wallace watched him with slight irritation. Kowalski saw this as a grand show, a firework display that would end the war. Wallace saw it as opening Pandora's box. He couldn't shake an image that had haunted him for weeks. Humanity was like a child who had found a loaded revolver in a sandbox, and now that child was about to pull the trigger just to see what would happen. Leo Silvers, a graduate student assigned to Wallace's group, was the most silent. He sat in a corner with a notebook, writing something down. But it wasn't formulas. It was poetry. For him, what was happening was not just a physics experiment, but a metaphysical act. Man was trying on the robes of God, and Leo was trying to capture this awe, this sacred madness, in words. He was the only one who understood Wallace's dark premonitions, but he expressed them not in the language of mathematics, but in the language of poetry. And Private Miller, a sturdy kid from Oklahoma, was just doing his job. He stood by the entrance, checked passes, and thought wistfully of home. To him, all these scientists were strange, otherworldly people, speaking an incomprehensible language. But he was following orders: to guard, to keep out, and to wait. The weather was turning. Nighttime thunderstorms, common in New Mexico at that time of year, forced a delay of the test. First by an hour, then another. The tension in the bunker grew, mixing with fatigue. Kowalski stopped joking and was now nervously flicking switches on his radio set. Wallace stepped away from his papers and was now looking through the narrow observation slit protected by thick leaded glass at the distant tower, barely visible in the darkness. It stood there like a totem to an ancient, cruel deity awaiting its hour. Finally, at 5:10 in the morning, the order came over the radio. The final countdown. The voice in the speaker was dispassionate, almost mechanical, but behind that calm, a colossal tension could be felt. Minus 20 minutes. Everyone took their places. Kowalski put on his headphones. Silvers set aside his notebook. Wallace lay on the floor, feet toward the tower, as instructed, and ordered everyone to do the same. He handed them special goggles, like welders' masks. "Do not take these off under any circumstances until I say so." His voice was firm and calm. Private Miller lay down beside him, his rifle seeming like a child's toy in the face of what was about to happen. Minus 45 seconds. The voice from the speaker continued the countdown. Wallace's heart was beating so loudly it felt as though everyone could hear it. He closed his eyes. His entire life, all his knowledge, all the sleepless nights spent over calculations had led to this moment. 3, 2, 1, 0. He was waiting for a sound, but there was none. On that last evening of the old world, Wallace, checking the strength of their bunker's concrete walls for the 100th time, had no idea that the main enemy they were about to face would not be the shockwave, not the heat, not even the radiation. Their main enemy would be the triumph of their own minds, embodied in the man-made sun that was about to rise over the desert. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, Mountain wartime, the world ceased to exist. There was no bang, no roar. First, there was silence, an absolute unnatural silence, as if sound itself had taken fright and frozen. And then came the light. It wasn't light in the conventional sense. It was the very essence of light, its primordial, unrestrained fury, unleashed. Even through the dark goggles, even with his eyes closed, Wallace saw his own bones. The bones of his hand, which he had raised to his face. For a split second he became transparent, an X-ray of himself. The desert outside the bunker walls, shrouded in pre-dawn gloom, became for an instant brighter than the midday sun. Every rock, every grain of sand, every cactus spine cast sharp black shadows. Then the violet glow gave way to a blinding whiteness that seared the retina, flooding everything with a milky, unearthly radiance. Kowalski couldn't help but let out an admiring groan. Silvers held his breath. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. It was what the ancient texts described when depicting the appearance of a deity. They had created a god, and its name was Death, the destroyer of worlds. The euphoria lasted for several seconds, the scientific awe, the pride in their accomplishment, the awareness of being part of the greatest event in human history. Wallace even allowed himself a faint smile. His calculations had been correct. Everything was going according to plan. And then, after 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, the sound came. At first it wasn't a sound, but a jolt. The earth beneath them shuddered, as if a giant beast had awoken in its depths and was stirring, shaking off its torpor. And following the jolt came the roar. It wasn't just a loud sound, it was a sound that could be felt with the body. It pressed on the eardrums, squeezed the chest, vibrated in the bones. It seemed as if the air itself had turned into a solid wall and slammed into their shelter with unimaginable force. The concrete bunker, designed to withstand anything, groaned. Cracks ran along the walls, and dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The single light bulb overhead popped with a dry snap, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the infernal light forcing its way through the observation slit. And in that moment, Wallace knew. He knew with terrifying clarity that they had made a mistake. Not a mistake in principle, but in scale. The force they had unleashed was greater, more monstrous than the boldest theory had predicted. Their calculations had been elegant, but reality proved to be crude and merciless. The earth shuddered again, this time more violently. There was a deafening screech of metal and the crack of breaking concrete. A section of the ceiling above the entrance collapsed, raising a cloud of suffocating dust. The heavy steel door, their only way out, was slammed, deformed, and jammed in its frame. Private Miller, who was lying closer to the exit, didn't have time to crawl away. A heavy slab pinned his legs. His scream was lost in the general roar. An impact. Darkness. The screech of metal. They were trapped. Slowly. Inexorably. Their shelter, their armor, their guarantee of safety had in an instant become their tomb. When the initial shock subsided and the roaring outside began to fade, replaced by an ominous, low hum, Wallace switched on the emergency lantern. Its beam snatched from the darkness a scene worthy of Goya's brush. Kowalski, white as a sheet, was trying to get up, brushing dust off himself. Silvers was crawling towards the moaning Miller, and Wallace himself, Arthur Wallace, the theoretical genius, looked at the blocked exit, then at the observation slit, beyond which a fireball now raged, and felt something he had never experienced in his life. Not fear. Fear was a rational emotion. This was a primal, metaphysical horror. The horror of a creator who has seen the true face of his creation. And that face was the face of the abyss. He looked at the terrified, deafened faces of his comrades, then at the massive, jammed hatch. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he would have to become not just their senior scientist, but their jailer, their prophet, and perhaps even their god. The first few minutes after the collapse were pure chaos. The air, thick with cement dust, was impossible to breathe. It gritted between their teeth, clogged their nostrils, and provoked a torturous cough that tore at their lungs. Private Miller was screaming. It wasn't a scream of pain, but the thin, piercing howl of a wounded animal, a mix of shock, terror, and the realization of his own helplessness. Frank Kowalski, having come to his senses, immediately lunged for his radio set. He frantically flicked switches, twisted tuning knobs, and shouted into the microphone, Base! This is South 10! Base, come in! We're buried! I repeat, we are buried. But the headphones were filled with only a dead silence, occasionally interrupted by the crackle of static. The antenna which ran to the surface had been destroyed. They were deaf and mute, cut off from the world. The realization hit Kowalski harder than any shock wave. His face contorted. They're not answering. God damn it. They're not answering. He jumped up and rushed to the blocked exit. His hands, the strong hands of a technician used to working with tools, gripped the warped steel frame of the door. He pulled, pushed, slammed his shoulder against the metal, but the door wouldn't budge a millimeter. It had been sealed into the concrete frame with a force equal to the wrath of gods. "Help me!" he yelled, turning to the others. "We have to break it down! All together!" But Arthur Wallace stopped him. He placed his thin, almost aristocratic hand on the technician's shoulder. "Frank, stop." His voice was surprisingly calm. The contrast between Kowalski's panic and Wallace's icy composure was stark. "What do you mean?" "Stop," Frank shot back. "We have to get out of here. We've been buried alive." "That's precisely why you need to calm down," Wallace said slowly, enunciating each word. "Listen." He turned off the lantern, plunging them into near-total darkness, broken only by a faint orange glow from the observation slit. And in that silence, they heard it. A quiet but insistent crackling. Click, click, click. The Geiger counter. Wallace switched the lantern back on and aimed the beam at the instrument on the wall. The dosimeter's needle was off the scale. It was twitching at the far right of the dial, as if trying to break free of its limits. "Do you understand what that means, Frank?" Wallace asked quietly. "Out there, right now, is hell. Not a metaphorical hell, but a very real, physical one. The air, the ground, everything around us is saturated with invisible death. If we somehow miraculously open this door now, we will die. Not immediately. We will die slowly and painfully. Our skin will be covered in sores. Our insides will turn to mush. Is that what you want?" Wallace wasn't trying to scare him. He was simply stating facts. He was describing reality as dispassionately as he would describe an equation on a blackboard. And this cold, scientific precision had a greater effect on Kowalski than any shout. He staggered back from the door, his face ashen. He looked at his hands as if he could already see the marks of radiation sickness on them. Meanwhile, Leo Silvers, with Wallace's help, managed to lift the slab slightly and free Miller's legs. They were twisted at an unnatural angle. Compound fractures. The man was conscious, but his gaze was clouded with pain. They moved him to the farthest corner of the bunker. Wallace conducted the first inventory. Their world had shrunk to the size of a 10 by 10 meter concrete box. Their resources: one emergency lantern with 2 sets of batteries, 3 canteens of water, one of which was almost empty, 4 packets of dry rations, a first aid kit with bandages, iodine, and morphine. And the Geiger counter, their curse and their only compass in this new radioactive world. Wallace established a new law, the law of total conservation. Speak only when necessary. Move as little as possible. Every extra breath, every extra movement burned precious oxygen and raised the level of carbon dioxide. Their prison was airtight. He became the dictator of this small, dying world. His iron will, backed by irrefutable knowledge, became the only force opposing chaos and panic. But when he was alone with his thoughts, studying the maxed-out needle of the dosimeter in the lantern's light, he realized the full monstrosity of their situation. The counter showed the maximum reading. That could mean anything. That the radiation level was slightly above normal, or that it was thousands of times deadlier. The instrument was useless. They were blind. They didn't know what kind of enemy they were dealing with. They had only a few hours of air left, maybe a day. This was the end. And it was then, in a moment of utter despair, that an idea was born in Wallace's mind. a mind accustomed to solving unsolvable problems. A mad, almost impossible idea. But it was the only one they had. He looked at his wristwatch, at the second hand, then at the dusty concrete floor. They needed a new instrument. And if they didn't have one, he would create it. Out of nothing. Their only window into the new world was the Geiger counter, but it was broken. Not in the sense that it didn't work. It worked too well. It screamed of mortal danger but couldn't say how great that danger was. It was like having a thermometer that only showed 2 readings, normal and you're burning in hell. For Arthur Wallace, a man for whom precision was a religion, such uncertainty was unbearable. He understood that their survival depended not on their water supply or the strength of the walls, but on a single parameter, the decay rate of radioactive isotopes, on how quickly the invisible death outside would lose its power. If it decayed slowly, they would suffocate long before the exit became safe. If it decayed quickly, they had a chance. But to know that, he needed data. Precise data. And he decided to get it. His unexpected weapon was not some clever device, but the sheer force of his intellect and his fundamental knowledge of physics. He turned their concrete prison into a laboratory. First, he needed a way to measure radiation, even if indirectly. He took the useless dosimeter off the wall and disassembled it. Inside was an ionization chamber, a small cylinder that registered particles. He couldn't fix it, but he could use another tool that each of them had. Personal dosimeters, small badges resembling fountain pens, which they wore on their coveralls. Inside each was a piece of special photographic film that darkened when exposed to radiation. The problem was that developing and analyzing this film required a whole laboratory. All they had was a flashlight and a concrete floor. Then Wallace came up with something brilliant in its simplicity. He turned to Leo Silvers. "Leo," he said, his eyes behind their thick lenses burning with a feverish gleam. "I need your help. You're going to be our instrument." He explained his plan. Near the observation slit there was a small crack in the wall, formed during the explosion. A faint stream of radioactive dust was seeping through it. Wallace fixed one of the dosimeters right next to this crack. "Every 30 minutes, he instructed Silvers, "we will place a new dosimeter by the slit, and we'll put the old one over here, in the farthest corner. We need to collect a series of samples to track the dynamics." Kowalski looked at him like he was insane. "And what good will that do?" he rasped. "We have no way to read them." "Not yet," Wallace answered calmly. "But we will." The next few hours turned into a strange, almost mystical ritual. Every 30 minutes, on a signal from Wallace, who was keeping time with his watch, Silvers would hold his breath, run to the crack, swap the dosimeters, and retreat. He became a living automaton, part of the experiment. This task, meaningful and orderly, helped him fight off the panic. He felt like a scientist again, not a victim. When they had accumulated 10 irradiated dosimeters, Wallace proceeded to the second part of the plan. He took the piece of graphite from his pocket and drew a large coordinate system on the concrete floor. The vertical axis was the radiation level. The horizontal axis was time. Then he opened the first dosimeter, the one that had been at the crack for the first half hour. He took out the tiny piece of film. It was almost black. He placed it at the base of the vertical axis. Then he opened the second. The film inside was slightly, by a barely perceptible shade, lighter. He placed it next to the first. And so on. When all 10 films were laid out in a row, they saw it. They saw it with their own eyes. It formed a curve, a smooth, almost perfect curve, showing how the blackness of the film, and thus the radiation level, gradually decreased over time. They didn't know the exact values, but they didn't need to. They needed the dynamics, and they had them. Wallace, using his knowledge of the half-lives of the main isotopes produced in a nuclear explosion, began his calculations. He extrapolated the resulting curve into the future. His graphite flew across the concrete, drawing complex logarithmic equations. Silvers and even the skeptical Kowalski watched him, holding their breath. He was like an ancient priest, reading the fate of his tribe in the stars. Finally, he stopped and circled a point on his diagram. "Here," he said, his voice trembling with excitement and exhaustion. "Right here. The curve crosses the conditional safety threshold." "When?" Silvers breathed. "When will that be?" Wallace looked up at them. "If my calculations are correct, in about 18 hours. Maybe 20. Not before. 18 hours. In their sealed trap, with a wounded man and dwindling oxygen, it was an eternity. But for the first time, they had something more than just hope for a miracle. They had a plan. A scientifically grounded plan for survival. They had defeated their blindness. They had looked their invisible enemy in the face and measured its strength. But Wallace, looking at the curve he had drawn on the floor, knew that this first victory was only the beginning. Their enemy was not only outside. Now that they had time, another, far more ancient and dangerous enemy was about to awaken in their small world: despair, madness, and rebellion. And to defeat it, formulas alone would not be enough. Having acquired the most valuable resource, knowledge, Arthur Wallace set about creating his small, harsh empire. He understood that 18 hours in a confined space under constant stress could destroy them faster than radiation or lack of oxygen. The human psyche is a fragile mechanism, and to keep it from breaking, it needs structure, order, ritual. They could only conquer the chaos outside with perfect order inside. His first decree was the law of total rationing. He gathered all their supplies in one corner and declared himself their sole custodian. Water was now dispensed 3 times a day. 1 small sip from the canteen cap. Food. 1 dry biscuit per person every 6 hours. This caused the first grumblings. "We're not in the army," Kowalski muttered. "Why can't we just divide everything equally?" "Because equally means you'll eat your share in an hour, and for the next 17, you'll watch me eat mine." Wallace cut him off without looking up. "That will breed envy, conflict, possibly theft. Centralized distribution creates discipline and gives a sense that we are being cared for. Our brain needs that feeling no less than our body needs water." He wasn't just a physicist. He was a brilliant psychologist. He understood that he needed to manage not just the resources, but the perception of those resources. The second law was the daily routine. Wallace divided their time into cycles. 4 hours of absolute silence and stillness to conserve oxygen, then 15 minutes for exercise, slow movements to prevent muscle atrophy, then a sip of water, and then another 4 hours of silence. He turned their existence into something resembling a monastic rule. The bunker became a monastery, and they, the novices, undergoing a severe trial. Leo Silvers was put in charge of the wounded Miller. He changed his bandages, gave him water, and when he was conscious spoke to him quietly, telling him about the stars, about distant galaxies, trying to lead his mind away from the pain and hopelessness. Wallace himself took on the role of high priest and chronicler. He started a logbook. In a plain notebook he always carried, he began to keep hourly records. He recorded everything. The readings from their improvised dosimeter, the amount of water consumed, the physical and psychological state of each crew member. He described it in dry scientific language, as if compiling a report on an experiment. Subject K, Kowalski, exhibits signs of increased nervousness and aggression. Subject S, Silvers, demonstrates stability, sublimating stress into care for the wounded. Subject M, Miller, remains in a stable but critical condition. This activity helped him maintain clarity of mind, to distance himself from the horror of the situation. He was not a victim, but an observer. Their little empire worked. The harsh but predictable rhythm of life gave them a foothold, preventing them from sliding into the abyss of despair. They were no longer just 3 terrified men locked in a box. They became a team. The crew of a submarine on a dive into unknown depths. Astronauts, lost in a strange, hostile world. This system, created by Wallace's intellect, became their psychological armor. But any empire, no matter how small, eventually faces the threat of rebellion. And that threat was brewing in the darkest and weakest link of their system, the soul of Frank Kowalski. He obeyed Wallace's orders, but did so with poorly concealed irritation. A man of action, he could not accept this forced passivity. To sit and wait for some invisible particles to decay seemed humiliating to him. He began to question Wallace's authority. At first in whispers, speaking to Silvers when Wallace was busy with his notes. "Do you really believe this gibberish on the floor?" he hissed. "He's just stalling. Maybe the rescuers are already outside trying to dig us out, and we're just sitting here like moles, waiting for his permission to breathe." He tried to win over Miller as well when the soldier was conscious. "Hang in there, kid," he would tell him. "We'll be out soon. Don't listen to the Four Eyes. He's ready to let us all die in here for his formulas." Wallace heard everything. He saw how the poison of doubt was beginning to work. He understood that a direct conflict was inevitable, and he prepared for it. He knew his power rested not on strength but on knowledge, and when the time came, he would strike with that very weapon. And so, on the 13th hour of their confinement, when fatigue and claustrophobia reached their peak, Kowalski made his move. He stood in the middle of the bunker, breaking the period of silence. "Enough," he said firmly, looking directly at Wallace. "I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. I heard a noise, the scrape of metal. They're digging us out. We have to help them. Give them a sign. We have to break down that door." His words hung in the thick, stale air. Their life, built on strict order, had settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of the new world. In the darkness of the concrete tomb, a rebellion began to brew. The conflict that had been brewing for hours erupted. Frank Kowalski stood in the center of the bunker, his posture a study in defiance. He was the voice of desperation, the voice of a simple animal instinct that screamed, "Run! Act! Do something!" In his eyes, Wallace was not a savior, but a jailer, a mad scientist willing to sacrifice them for the purity of his experiment. "What noise, Frank?" Arthur asked calmly, not getting up. His composure infuriated Kowalski even more. "There are no noises here but the beating of our hearts and the crackle of the dosimeter." "I heard it!" Kowalski repeated stubbornly, his voice cracking into a shout. "The scraping of shovels, or an excavator. They're looking for us, and you want us to suffocate in here." Leo Silvers looked up. He was exhausted too. He too wanted to believe in rescue. "Arthur, maybe he's right?" he asked hopefully. "Maybe we should try?" Wallace rose slowly. He looked not at Kowalski but at Silvers. "Try what, Leo? Try to die?" Frank isn't hearing rescuers. He's hearing what he wants to hear. His brain, pushed to the limit by fear and hypoxia, is creating auditory hallucinations. It's a classic symptom. Then he turned to Kowalski, and instead of arguing or threatening him, he employed his surgical cruelty. He decided not just to suppress the rebellion, but to cauterize its very source, false hope. "All right, Frank, let's say you're right. Let's say we somehow manage to break down this twisted door. What then? Do you know what will happen to you when you breathe that air?" He took a step forward, his voice becoming quiet, almost hypnotic. He began his lecture. A lecture on death. At first you won't feel anything. Maybe a slight metallic taste in your mouth. You'll step outside and see that the desert has turned to glass. You'll be happy to be free. But within an hour, you'll start to feel nauseous. Severe, uncontrollable vomiting that will turn you inside out. Your nervous system will begin to fail. You'll lose coordination. You won't be able to walk straight. That's the first stage. Then comes the latent period. It will seem like it's over. For a day, maybe two. You'll think you've been saved. But during this time, the radiation will be doing its work. It will be killing the cells in your bone marrow. Your blood will stop clotting. Your white blood cells will die. And any infection, any microbe, will become fatal. And then the third stage will begin. Your hair will fall out. Your skin will blister and ulcerate, and the sores won't heal. Your gums will bleed. You'll start having internal hemorrhages. You will bleed from every orifice of your body. You will lie in your own filth as your body rots alive, and you will be fully conscious. You will understand everything, and you will beg for a death that won't come for several more weeks. Wallace fell silent. A dead silence filled the bunker. Even Miller had stopped moaning. Kowalski stood swaying, his face whiter than chalk. Wallace hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. He had simply painted a picture. A detailed, clinically precise picture. And for that reason, 1,000 times more terrifying than any threat. He had used knowledge as the most sophisticated weapon of torture. But Kowalski had been pushed to his limit. Logic no longer worked on him. "You're lying," he screamed, but his voice lacked conviction, containing only hysteria. "You made all that up to keep us in here." He shoved Wallace aside and rushed to the door again. He grabbed a piece of rebar and began furiously beating the mangled metal. Each blow echoed deafeningly in the small space. Wallace knew that words would no longer work. He had to act. He lunged at Kowalski from behind, grabbed his neck, and applied a hold he had been taught in the army. A sharp pressure on the carotid artery. Kowalski choked, his body went limp, and he collapsed unconscious on the floor. Wallace stood over him, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. He, a man of science, a man of reason, had resorted to brute force. He had crossed a line. Silvers looked at him with a mixture of horror and respect. He realized that Wallace had just saved all their lives, at the cost of his own humanity. He had upheld his law. The rebellion was crushed. But while they were dealing with each other, they hadn't noticed that their real enemy, their concrete prison, was preparing its final devastating blow. In the silence that followed the struggle, they heard a new sound. A quiet, scraping sound. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from above, from the ceiling, as if someone, or something, was trying to dig its way in. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible. A rustle, a scrape, like a giant rat clawing at the other side of the concrete ceiling. Leo Silvers was the first to look up, his face a mask of confusion. Arthur Wallace, still standing over Kowalski's body, froze, listening. This was not the sound of rescuers. It was too chaotic, too natural. Wallace aimed the lantern beam at the ceiling and saw something that made his blood run cold. The ceiling, riddled with cracks, was vibrating. Fine concrete dust showered down on their heads. He understood. This wasn't an attack from the outside. It was their own prison, beginning to die. The explosion hadn't just damaged the bunker. It had disturbed the structure of the ground around it. And now tons of sand and rock, unsettled by the shockwave, were slowly but inexorably pressing down on their shelter, trying to crush it like an eggshell. The scraping they heard was the sound of shifting earth and the groaning of rebar holding back the colossal weight with its last ounce of strength. Suddenly, one of the ceiling slabs sagged with a deafening crack, and a stream of sand and dust poured through the resulting gap. But it wasn't just dust. In the lantern's light, Wallace saw it shimmer and glow in the darkness. Radioactive dust, the deadliest substance on the planet. And it was pouring directly onto the spot where the wounded Private Miller lay. In that moment, there was no time for thought, for calculations. There was only time for instinct. Leo Silvers, the quiet poet, the man who until now had only followed orders, lunged forward. He scooped up Miller and tried to drag him aside. But the wounded soldier was heavy, and Leo was exhausted. He only managed to drag him a few feet before the next wave of dust engulfed him. He coughed, choking, inhaling death. Wallace realized they had seconds before the gap widened and they were buried alive under tons of radioactive sand. "The suits!" he yelled, snapping out of it. "Take off the coveralls!" He ripped off the top part of his own protective suit. "Plug the gap with them, quickly!" It was a desperate, insane decision to use their only protection against radiation as a plug. But there was no other choice. He grabbed his coverall, twisted it into a tight bundle, and standing on a crate, tried to shove it into the crack. Silvers, recovering, did the same. Even Kowalski, who was just regaining consciousness, saw what was happening and joined them without a word. For a few minutes, they became a single organism again, driven by one goal: to survive. It was a desperate, almost primal battle. They pushed, compacted the fabric, trying to stop the flow of death. The sand burned their hands, the dust clogged their lungs, but they didn't stop. Finally, they succeeded. The stream subsided, the hole was plugged. They collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, covered in a layer of glowing dust. The Geiger counter, which had only been crackling before, was now wailing shrilly. The radiation level inside the bunker had skyrocketed tenfold. They had won the battle against the collapse, but had perhaps lost the war against the invisible enemy. Wallace aimed the lantern at Silvers. He was sitting on the floor, vomiting. It was the first, most terrible symptom. Leo had received a massive dose. Private Miller, who had swallowed a lungful of dust, was wheezing and pink foam frothed at his mouth. He was dying. Their little empire was collapsing. All their calculations, all their order, had been swept away by a blind, chaotic force. They were on the verge of complete physical and moral exhaustion. Wallace looked at his diagram on the floor. There were still 4 hours until the calculated time of salvation. 4 hours in this radioactive hell. They wouldn't make it. It was over. And it was at that very moment, in the deafening silence that followed the struggle, broken only by the wail of the dosimeter and Miller's death rattle, that Kowalski, lying by the observation slit, made a strange sound. It wasn't a cry of terror. It was a whisper, full of astonishment. "Light!" he rasped. "I see a light!" Wallace crawled over to him. He peered through the narrow slit, and he saw them. 2 bright beams cutting through the dusty gloom. Headlights. The headlights of a vehicle moving slowly in their direction. Rescue had come. But the price of this victory was terrifying. There was no euphoria, no joyful cries, no hugs, no tears of happiness. When the rescuers, clad in bulky, lead-lined suits and gas masks that made them look like alien monsters, finally cut open the jammed door with an acetylene torch, the 4 inhabitants of Bunker S-10 greeted them in silence. They sat in their concrete tomb, covered in a layer of radioactive dust, and stared at their deliverers with empty, hollowed-out eyes. The contrast was monstrous. The people outside represented strength, technology, civilization, and they, the scientists who had created that technology, had been reduced to primitive cavemen, survivors of a hell that had poisoned them forever. The first thing the rescuers did was carry out the body of Private Miller. He had died half an hour before their arrival. His death would later be attributed in official reports to an accident during structural collapse. The word radiation would not be mentioned. Then they were brought out. Silvers, who could barely stand and was vomiting continuously, was carried on a stretcher. Kowalski walked on his own but swayed like a drunk and smiled meaninglessly. Wallace was the last to leave. He clutched his notebook, the chronicle of their survival, tightly in his hand. When he stepped out of the bunker, he was blinded by light. Not the light of the sun, but the harsh, lifeless light of searchlights mounted on military trucks. The surrounding desert was unrecognizable. The sand had melted and fused into a greenish, uneven glass that crunched under the rescuers' boots. The sky was shrouded in a brownish haze. The air smelled of ozone and bitterness. It was the landscape of another planet. They were immediately subjected to decontamination. Their filthy coveralls were ripped off and they were hosed down with ice-cold water and some kind of foam. They stood naked and shivering while men in masks scrubbed them with stiff brushes, washing away the invisible filth. It was humiliating. It felt less like a rescue and more like the sanitary processing of livestock. Their world, where they had been gods and kings, where they had built their own system and defeated the abyss, was brutally and unceremoniously destroyed. They were shoved into a lead-lined van and driven to a field hospital, but instead of care and sympathy, they faced an interrogation. A man in a perfectly clean military uniform with no insignia entered their tent. His face was impenetrable, his gaze as cold as steel. He didn't ask how they felt. He asked what had happened. Wallace, as the senior member of the group, began to explain. He told them about the explosion being more powerful than calculated, about the collapse, the jammed door, his method of measuring radiation, Kowalski's rebellion, the ceiling breach. He spoke calmly and detachedly as if giving a lecture. The man in the uniform listened in silence without interrupting. When Wallace finished, he asked only one question. "Doctor, do you understand that your account casts a shadow on the flawless success of the entire Trinity project?" Wallace didn't immediately grasp the question's meaning. "I'm just telling you what happened," he replied. "What happened was a successful test of the device," the man in the uniform stated flatly. "All systems perform nominally. All shelters held. Any other information is disinformation that could harm national security in a time of war. Do you understand me?" And then Wallace understood everything. Their survival, their feat, their hell. It was all an inconvenient truth. A stain on the pristine mantle of the victors. Their story was not a heroic saga, but evidence of a miscalculation. Proof that the creators did not fully understand the force they had unleashed. Such a truth was not needed. It was dangerous. That evening, the three of them were gathered in one tent. The same man in uniform placed a piece of paper and a pen in front of each of them. It was a non-disclosure agreement for state secrets. By signing it, they pledged to forget forever what happened in Bunker S-10, to forget their 18 hours in hell, to forget the death of Private Miller, to forget their small, tragic empire. The system had delivered its verdict. Their feat wasn't just classified, it was annulled. From that moment on, it officially did not exist. It was the final, most brutal blow. They had survived the battle with the atom, only to lose the clash with the soulless military machine. Their brotherhood, forged in radioactive fire, was destroyed by an order from above. Their ordeal was buried alive, this time under the stamp, Top Secret. The fates of the survivors of Bunker S-10 varied, but each was invisibly scarred by that day. They returned to civilization but remained its permanent exiles, bearers of a terrible knowledge they were forbidden to speak of. Their souls remained there, in the dusty concrete box, under the melted New Mexico sky. Arthur Wallace returned to his scientific work. He became a respected professor, a winner of many awards. But something inside him had broken. The fire of the discoverer had vanished from his eyes. He became withdrawn, reclusive. His colleagues attributed it to the eccentricity of a genius, not knowing that behind his silence lay not arrogance, but the infinite weariness of a man who had peered over the edge and seen only a cold, mathematically precise void. He never worked in nuclear physics again. He dedicated the rest of his life to astronomy, studying distant dead stars. It was said that at night he would spend hours at his telescope, as if trying to find in the cold abyss of space the answer to a question that haunted him until his dying day. He died at a ripe old age, in his bed, surrounded by books. His official biography contained not a single word about the Trinity site. Frank Kowalski was discharged from the Army a few months after the incident with a diagnosis of combat stress. His rebellion, his desperate attempt to break free, was interpreted as a sign of cowardice and instability. He returned to his native Chicago and tried to live a normal life. He worked as an electrician, got married, had children, but every night he had the same nightmare. A cramped concrete room, a blocked door, and the icy voice of Wallace describing radiation sickness. He started drinking, heavily, desperately, trying to drown the memories and the constant irrational fear of an invisible death. His marriage fell apart. He died at 52 from cirrhosis of the liver in a cheap motel. His former colleagues from the Manhattan Project never even learned of his death. He simply vanished, erased from history. The most tragic fate was that of Leo Silvers. The young, talented physicist and poet who had rushed to save the wounded soldier received the largest dose of radiation that day. The latent period, which Wallace had described with such cruel accuracy, lasted almost 5 years for him. For 5 years, he lived an ordinary life, teaching at a university, writing poems that would never be published. And then the disease manifested itself. Acute leukemia. The doctors were powerless. He faded quickly and painfully before the eyes of his young wife. He never told her where or how he had received his fatal dose. He took that secret to his grave, remaining faithful to his non-disclosure agreement to the very end. He became the first official, yet unacknowledged victim of the atomic era among its creators. His death in 1950 was just a statistic, one of many cancer deaths in post-war America. And what became of the primary artifact of their survival? Arthur Wallace's notebook, in which he had kept his dispassionate journal. After the interrogation, the notebook was confiscated from him by a security officer as a document containing classified information. It was supposed to be placed in the project's archives under top secret classification. But years later, when the archives were partially declassified, historians found no trace of the journal. It had simply disappeared, vanished into the bureaucratic abyss. Perhaps it was destroyed as evidence that was too inconvenient. Evidence that on the day of its greatest triumph, the human mind had encountered a force it could neither predict nor control. And so, the official history was written. July 16th, 1945. A day of flawless success. The day science triumphed. The day the key to ending the most terrible war in human history was forged. In the grand reports and newspaper articles, there was no room for the small buried bunker S-10. No room for one dead soldier and 3 broken scientists. Their story, their 18 hours on the edge of existence, was sacrificed on the altar of a great victory. But a story that is erased from paper does not die. It goes underground. It becomes a legend. Among the soldiers and junior technical staff who worked at the Trinity site, rumors began to spread. At first, it was just whispers in smoking areas and canteens. They told of the unlucky 10th bunker, the one that was too close. They said it had been almost completely destroyed, and the people inside. Here the versions diverged. Some claimed they had all died instantly. Others, lowering their voices, said the scientists inside had gone mad, that they had seen something no man should ever see, that they had looked into the fiery eyes of the newborn God, and that gaze had burned out their sanity. The story turned into a soldier's tale, a local ghost story. Bunker S-10 became a kind of cursed place, one people tried not to speak of aloud. Its ruins were quickly covered by sand, and soon no one could point out exactly where it had been. It vanished not only from documents but from the face of the earth, becoming a ghost, a legend of the desert. It was said that at night, near that spot, you could hear a faint clicking. Perhaps a Geiger counter, or perhaps the tap of graphite on a concrete floor. Among the young physicists who joined the project after the war, there was a belief that the spirit of Dr. Wallace still wandered the test site, writing endless formulas on the fused desert glass, trying to find the error in his calculations. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten incident. It is a parable about creators consumed by their creation, about how the greatest discoveries are often made by fumbling in the dark, and the price for them can be immeasurably high. It is a reminder that behind every great triumph, behind every line in a history textbook, there are nameless victims, forgotten feats, and stories that were too terrifying and inconvenient to become the truth. The story of Arthur Wallace, Frank Kowalski, and Leo Silvers was not recorded in the annals of science, but it was forever seared into the very fabric of the new atomic age as its first quiet, and terrible warning. A warning that when men begin to play God, they risk being the first to be sacrificed upon their own altars.